welcome, guys, to the stage. I think we can start with Margaret Ann. Yeah, give them a big applause. And then Janus. And then Bente Sollid. And last but not least, Scott Brinker. So the question is if this is a hot seat or not, but let's see. I have some questions that we prepared, and we're going analog. I was inspired by Margaret Ann when it said reading books, which is good. So the first question, and what I'm going to do is I'm not going to write down the questions to you, but I will basically take the topic. So it allows us to be a bit more flexible as well. So the first question, when we talk about the role of AI in defining authenticity, and I think it's natural for us to direct that also to Margaret Ann. Things have been to a certain extent answered in the morning, but I think it's definitely good to have a recap and getting some people to weigh in. How do people feel about authenticity when AI is a part of the process?
Thank you for the question. Well, based on the research that I did at the Institute of Art, Design and Technology, when we were looking at the combination of DALL-E, D-A-L-L-E, and DALL-E, D-A-L-I, it was perfectly acceptable from a neurological point of view. There was no uncanny valley. There was no problem with people feeling a negative sentiment about a reconstitution of the classic surrealist art in a fully immersive environment. However, take the DALL-E reconstitution of the surrealist art, and there was a problem. It was an alienating fact. So this, of course, is qualitative research on one level, done in Copenhagen, actually, at the DALL-E exhibition there. I think that the sense that the research gave me was, and this was a quote from one, that creativity is a human concern, and that creativity is, you have the sense of something that is creative, not created, which is something else, because an AI can create something, but it's not human creativity. And there is a sense that we have a sixth sense for what is human as opposed to AI generated. Hopefully that answers somehow.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting answer, and you also touched on it this morning. One of the things that I find interesting is that you're clearly, speaking about using the tools and not being, alienated by them as long as there's humans involved,
yes,
right?
Exactly, human in the loop.
Yeah. So, of course, we have to be honest and say one thing we forgot is to introduce Bente and Janus. So I will do that, but let's finish this question if that's okay. Anyone cares to weigh in on this one?
I figured I might stir the pot a bit on
Please
the
go
other end
ahead.
of the spectrum.
That's good.
Which, by the way, actually, I almost entirely agree with, and loved your presentation earlier today. But one thing I just sort of put out as a thought exercise is this feels like a slippery slope. Because the truth is, in pretty much every digital marketing platform for easily the past 5, if not 10 years, machine learning has been baked into it in all sorts of ways. We use it to identify segments of audiences. We use it to do send time optimization for emails. And so it's interesting that only now, because the generative AI stuff is so in our face, and we have to face things that very clearly become obvious to the recipients, to our audience, that we're having this discussion about okay, the authenticity of this, and how will people know, is this real, is it not real? But when you go further away from that direct touch point experience, I guess it's not always clear to me that authenticity challenge exists to the same degree.
Would you like me to give you a retort?
Oh, I'd love that.
So being Irish, I'm always loving a bit of a bargy, so here it comes. Your opening slide today, which stated, I think was the answer to the question, that, from Marcom's point of view, there's a decreasing circle of attention to email newsletter marketing, lack of involvement, there's not a lot of traction, and people are getting exhausted and have marketing fatigue. And I think that lends itself back to the commoditization of content, and people are just tired and disinterested. So the question is, how do you recapture the awe? It's a little bit like a long-term marriage, you know? You always have to reinvent yourself, but it has to be authentic.
So if I were just to rephrase that, it's not that the machine learning or whatnot per se is the problem. It's that because it has so accelerated and multiplied, you know, what we're doing, that it's actually, it's not the fact that this email had machine learning somewhere involved in the process. It's because everybody using machine learning to like automate these things has gotten it from like, okay, if you want to take the time for a human being to like write me an email, there was a finite number of emails I would get. And now that number is just stretching into infinity, and that's part of the pain.
Exponential boredom.
I love it.
This is good. It's a heat seat, so that's nice. I think it definitely makes sense to introduce Bente. If you want to weigh in on this, and then you can, of course, present yourself afterwards.
Yes, we very often talk about if AI is giving us the real picture of it, or if it's something fake. But think about the other dimension, that some years ago I was working with data-driven attribution. And we were analyzing a waste amount of data just to try to see what is the real situation, what's the true value for the audience. And AI can be, yes, of course, giving us a lot of fake and or not the real impression of things, but analyzing data, AI is so much, it's so broad and it's systemic, and using AI to just look into patterns, try to find the right conclusions, find the right answer, that can be more authentic than if a human eye is trying to solve the problem.
I think that's a good way to start to present yourself as well, because you definitely have been in this game for a long time, and I know you have a lot of experience as well. And that's, you know, one of the next questions I have is also going to be about speaking when it comes to AI, because, you know, everyone today knows about the buzzword of generative AI, but I think AI is so much more, and that's what we're going to see as well. And I would definitely like, after you have presented yourself, to you know, mention some of the interesting areas, and you mentioned one now, which is very different to generative AI, right? And I think, you know, that's where we're going, is, you know, what are the limitations? Are there any limitations? And I think that's quite interesting. So just sort of quickly introduce yourself. I think that makes sense.
Yes, I was 25 years when I started my own internet company, and that was in 1993, the year before the browser. And 7 years later, we were listed at Stockholm Stock Exchange with a market cap, 900 million euros. So I'm one of the pioneers in internet in Norway. Today I work as a board professional, so I'm chairing 4 tech companies, 1 international, and I'm in the board of 7 large listed family-owned companies. So we are working with transformation, digital transformation, all of them, and just now trying to understand what AI really is, because it's a huge shift, and everyone should actually try to understand it. So my view on AI is, I'm an entrepreneur, so I want to look into the possibilities. Of course, we need to handle the risks, but we need to try to understand, everyone, how this is affecting our industry, the business that we're working in.
Thanks. We'll definitely come back to some of those, you know, concepts and ideas. Janus, you should also present yourself.
All right, so I'll start with that. It's a pleasure to be here in Barcelona. Thanks for having me. I was also here last year, so it's good to see some familiar faces, but also many new ones. I may be the only panelist who's been spending the last 25 years in this space. CMS, actually back then it was called Internet Publishing Systems, now DXP. I don't want to spend too much time with the different terms, but I think when Scott mentioned ML, I think it made me think that it's a little bit similar with AI. That's a term that's a lot of confusion around it, and some of it is probably more ML, certainly, than it's intelligence. Panels can be hard at conferences, also end of day. My impression is that most people feel fine using AI as a part of the content creation process. Perhaps unknowingly they've already used machine learning for spell checking or other things. Does that make it less authentic? Probably a little bit, but I think it's a better experience for everyone to have something that's spelled right with commas, etc. Now I think it's taken to the 10x, so we can do much more. I think there is something here that we will probably explore further also later today and tomorrow. It's the topic of trust and trustworthiness that you raised, which I think will become a real differentiator. But I think also when we look back, perhaps in 2013, at an even bigger Ibexa summit, I can't imagine how big it will be by then if it keeps growing as much as it did from last year. But we might look back at 2025, circa this time, and say this was the time when something happened in this space. Those of you who have done CMS, DXP for 10 years can perhaps remember that with the advent of cell phones, smartphones, a whole new breed of headless vendors came onto space, which is a kind of geeky thing for this CMS space. Just a small part of the universe in Scott's map. But I think we're in a similar moment now where we will see a whole new arrival of additional vendors and existing vendors taking new approaches because they are born in this AI-ready age. So a lot of interesting things going on right now.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, and of course, sitting here, having been part of the CMS and the DXP game as well for many, many years now, I think it is interesting what we did at Ibexa was to take a very agnostic approach, right? So it was mentioned today that we allow anyone to use their own LLMs, and that it's kind of a framework that we're offering. And I think, is it going to be opinionated? I was very clear when I was asked sort of humbly to moderate this, to not go into discussion on, regions, LLMs, versions of XYZ. That's not why we're here, and I think it's important to understand what's sort of driving this as well behind AI, right? So moving to the next one, which is going to be new possibilities with AI. One of the things, because it's very easy to either go, black or white. And I think that's something we have to be very careful with. And one of the things I was reflecting on is how can AI help small teams or individuals achieve what only big companies could do before? I think that there's a lot of interesting aspects to that. Anyone wants to start off? You want to start, Bente?
Yes, because it's for small companies. There's a lot of gifts out there just now. Just remember what happened. I know you won't talk about LLMs, but DeepSeek is for free, and we are spoiled in this part of the world because we can afford to actually pay for software. But think about how other countries can use open source and how other countries can use LLMs, which are free, to actually work for better equality, better education. It starts with knowledge, to know how you can use technology to actually speed up the economy in developing countries. There is so many possibilities, and just to work smarter with AI tools gives the small businesses a lot of opportunities. And so we can afford everything in this part of the world, but this is not what's it's not the situation in Africa, it's not the situation in developing countries in Asia, and so
it's on the democratizing part,
they
right?
can get access to business plans, to strategies, to create content, logos, pictures, videos, which is just a tiny part of the cost. And I think that will help a lot of businesses.
Anyone wants to weigh in?
Sure. I have three things with A. I think one was already covered here, which is access. I think it's what Scott has talked about also, and if you followed his blog, in terms of democratization. I think this gives access to a whole range of people also in the Global South that didn't have access before. Then there's a topic that's close to my heart, which I think is a little bit the bad consciousness of many of us, certainly for me, having worked in this industry for a while, and that's accessibility. I actually think AI can help us quite a lot achieve accessibility regulations faster than the manual approach of the past. Automatically tagging images, alternative text for images, and I think that gives me hope that we can use AI for something good. And then last but not least, which I think is interesting for many in the room, I think it also has huge impact on agencies. I actually myself thought for a while that the biggest impact first would be on the vendor side, seeing the progress in the demo from Sylvain today compared to last year, quite a lot of progress. Other vendors, DXP vendors, have done similar things, adding what you could call cool features and improvements to existing products. But when I look at what's happening at the agency landscape and also how customer expectations are going up, how they don't want to necessarily pay for 8 months of prototyping or even 8 weeks of prototyping when with AI help, they can get it done in 8 days. So I think the agency businesses are being impacted, but there's also a lot of new possibilities for agency to disrupt the space using AI.
Anyone else? You want to go, Scott?
I was just going to build on one quick thing on the democratization, because, like one example, like you were talking about data analysis, right? Small businesses can't afford data scientists. So even while things like some of this AI technology could say, well, it's not as good as a human data scientist, it could still make errors, all that's true. It's still, for a bunch of small businesses, they don't have access to any of that capability. And to even give them 80% of that, I think is a real gift. And the other thing I would say about small businesses in this revolution, and I'm curious to then hear your response on this too, for better and worse, small businesses are more agile and they're less risk averse. They're willing to be more bold and try things than larger companies. And I think this is a really interesting time for that, because there's a lot of these technologies that a lot of larger companies, probably for very good reasons, are hesitant about, like, oh, I don't know, should we experiment with it? Should we try this? And I think small businesses will be the ones who actually pioneer a lot of, oh, how's this actually work? What's actually possible with it?
So, moderator, can I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I concur with everything that has been said. Applications for AI to do tasks, for example, let's talk about human review. For the dark part of the internet, where many of the companies hire 25-year-old reviewers who see things on the internet that they can never unsee. And as a content person myself, being very aware of the multifaceted nature of content, so not just large language models and text. And so, I'm looking at the broader remit of what a publisher would do, which is very much multi-platform. We might be producing content for 10 or 12 mediums simultaneously. That I see great possibilities for those parts of the piece in terms of human review that we just don't want to look at as human beings, that we could train an AI to basically do and to eliminate. The question of authenticity, and just for the avoidance of misunderstanding, yes, I completely concur. We use spell check. So we use AI on a daily basis. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about misrepresentation, saying that this is human creativity when it's actually machine creativity. That's really what I'm talking about authenticity. And the misrepresentation of a tone of voice, which is basically not a human tone of voice, but it's a machine determining to basically circumvent the natural instinct that we would have as a somatic entity to try to convince us to move towards a particular goal. That's lacking in authenticity, because it's a circumvention of the nature of the human sensory perception, which is, absent in technology, but very fundamental to our well-being. So I just throw that out there.
Janus, you want to weigh in?
Just 2 more things with A to keep it easy. I think a topic here that doesn't always get the attention it deserves is automation. So a lot of possibilities inside DXP for automation. Second, and perhaps a kind of public secret, that's authoring. I think most of these platforms, DXP, CMS, are kind of created to manage and author content campaigns. but most organizations actually don't use it like that. The content is created somewhere else. The marketing campaign is born in a spreadsheet or Google Docs or Microsoft Word. So I think there's some new possibilities here to solve those initial 85% that most DXPs don't solve because they worry about the last 15%. So I think we have some new possibilities there to fundamentally do something that's better and create solutions for the 100% and not just for the last 15%.
So this is not, I mean, some of these questions have already been shared with you, so you kind of could prep on some of them, but in terms of working with boards, for instance, what is the current landscape? You know, what is the knowledge level? We know that in general, they may be very interested in tech, but they may not necessarily think too much about what it's actually possible to do. And, you know, any thoughts around that?
Well, most boards are finance-driven. That's not a secret. That's how it is. And especially when you are a listed company, you need to be finance-driven, risk-driven. I've been working with boards since late in the 90s with listed companies, and then the board started to actually recruit a digital board member. But the digital board member didn't have so many people to talk with in the boards because everyone is supposed to know finance, and that's how the board can actually discuss finance. But most boards, they don't have any digital, heavy, savvy knowledge. So when AI just came out of the blue in November 2022, boards quickly understood that this is a technology that can actually improve the profitability and the productivity in every company. And they have a lot of respect for saving 20% or being more efficient, improving the profitability. That's a language that boards really know how to speak. But to be innovators and to understand how this technology will change the future, to strategically understand how this is going to change every industry, there is a lot that needs to be done. To actually, the basic knowledge about tech and digital innovation is definitely lowest in the board in every corporation. That's my definite, that's how
That's
my
your
experience is, yes.
Yeah. Okay, interesting.
So I spent about 15 years on boards of media companies, from small ones to big ones, and in an act of deep frustration with finding nobody to talk to, I went back to university and started hanging around with 22-year-olds. So, and I found that, you know, the general diversity and inclusion movement was very accepting of women over 50, so I decided to stay even longer, to my great advantage. Now, that's a sidebar to the next thing that I really want to say, which is, along this journey, I decided to go back to the Institute of Directors, do the directorship program, and start working on ESG and start working on the triple bottom line. So a triple bottom line corporation, people, planet, profit, we have a unique opportunity as directors and CEOs to take some of those savings and to re-engineer what we do as corporations, to think much more broadly than just simply bottom line based. And I know that sounds maybe very idealistic. I am an idealist by nature. But above all things, I mean, the cost of technology, the hidden cost on the carbon factor, we have to include that in our P&Ls. I mean, we can't be so blind as to think that this technology is basically free.
Yep, Bente.
Yeah, and the moments, as I call it, every time we see something new disrupting, even the digital tech companies can be disrupted, because the future is all about how can we use technology to deliver, let's say, the 17 UN sustainable goals, which is the problems, which is the challenges that we need to solve by technology. Almost everyone will be solved by technology and AI and technologies that are working together with AI. But every moment is like a surprise. So how we see the future and not just thinking that we can wait. This is not a big hurry because this will take time, and it's actually a lack of entrepreneurial culture in businesses that is putting everyone on the bench, and we will have to wait and see how this will develop. But the development now is really, really fast.
So is it right to say that, you know, all the boards and all of the big corporations have a strong urgency to do something with AI, and they kind of feel that they're, you know, falling behind in a way, but they're not necessarily sure how to approach it?
History is speaking. If you look at the S&P 500 list from 2000, I think in 2017, 50% of those companies were not on the list anymore. And I think we already know when OpenAI launched ChatGPT, Google panicked. And now American companies are a little bit panicked because a Chinese company have solved the computing power, less computing power, less need for energy to run those models. So the moments, the shifts, changes things overnight. And if you look 5 years ahead, I think the world as we know it today, we will see new companies coming up. And those companies, they need to integrate AI in their software, or the software is changing to become something else. Agents, automation. All repetitive tasks will be automated. And everything that can be digital has been digital. We know that for 20 years, 30 years now. Everything that can be automated will be automated or robotized. That's...
Yeah, I guess, you know, when you speak about automation, I don't, you know, the ethical aspect is probably not where it's really interesting to discuss, because everyone knows that it's a repetitive task. You know, someone has to do it, if it is a machine or if it is you, but, you know, the question is what makes sense to do. But in terms of ethics, because that's always going to be something to discuss, and I think that's important here, if we talk about balancing speed with ethical creation, so how can companies use AI to save time but still follow their values and keep their work honest?
Simple answer, I think, is transparency. Tell the world how you work. What's your ethical guidelines? And if you don't have the ethical guidelines, everyone need to actually rethink the guidelines, include AI. In EU, we get a lot of help from Brussels, but everyone needs to have ethical guidelines and being transparent. Don't tell the world that this article is written by a journalist if it's written by a large language models. I'm also in the board of a media company in Scandinavia, and it's the sustainable goal that is the highest goal for media companies is to avoid fake news. So we can use AI in many different ways, but not using AI to write articles. That's forbidden in media companies.
So Scott, it's natural, because I know those are European, so I wanted to kind of ask you in terms of what you see in the US, because we also know that, you know, this is not going to be about legislation and jurisdiction and whatnot, but what are your, you know, what's your take on this in terms of what you see there as well?
So as the representative American on the board, damn the torpedoes, yes, ethics, I think, so actually, I think the framing there on transparency is the right one, particularly for things that, again, the actual the direct output of the AI is directly touching the customer or the audience. And this kind of goes to, again, like what your presentation really honed in on, I think it's right, is people can tell. We should actually, this is an aside, but there was this thing, the Turing test, that in computer science for a long time was this big deal of like, okay, if you didn't know if this thing on the other side of the wall was a human or a computer, and you were talking back and forth with it, could you tell the difference? You know, and in theory, actually, that was the big thing everyone was excited about when ChatGPT first came out, is like, essentially claimed like, oh yeah, this is past the Turing test, because they had cases like, I couldn't tell, was that an AI or wasn't it? But as the, what would be the word for it, the scope of the things we're interacting with are getting larger, I think you're right. People actually, the uncanny valley, they have this sense of like, no, this is AI. I do kind of find myself wondering, though, as the AI keeps getting better, is there like this next generation of the Turing test where for many different media, you know, when will we be able to sense the difference or not? And maybe the answer is we'll always have that sense, but I don't know, that's a big open question. I think it ties to the ethics, because I think, you know, the more it gets to the place where it's really hard for people to distinguish between this, I think there'll sort of be a, you know, the blurring of those lines for the audience. I wonder the degree to which they start to blur the lines inside the creators, that they're like, well, I mean, it doesn't matter to the audience, why should it matter to us? The last thing I would say about ethics, the one that I actually worry about more, that I'm not sure transparency is necessarily the full solution to, is really it goes to the automation thing and what you were talking about, that, okay, yeah, you could say there's a bunch of these very rote manual tasks that nobody wants to do, so having AI do it, great. Maybe, but there's a whole bunch of people who are employed doing that. And while this has certainly been the case throughout history of technology displacing, you know, other ways, earlier ways in which things got done, I don't think we've ever seen anything in history that has the potential to happen at this scale and at this speed. And I think that's actually even a far greater ethical challenge, because to your point too, on like the profit motivation of corporations, there's going to be a real tension between like, okay, how do we think about this as a society, and for any individual corporation, how quickly do they move from things that humans are doing this to turning over AI?
All right.
Janus?
I'll just throw in, I think, a common misconception in the entire tech space, also in DXP specifically. And I know Scott Brinker has done some amazing work also with the Stackies, celebrating case studies of organizations who have used a unique combination from the MarTech universe to build really amazing competitive solutions. But I think there's this conception that plagues us and has unfortunately also spilled over to other parts of the world, and that's this misnotion that more is better. That 14 sports articles is better than 20 sports articles a day. 5 tools is better than 1 tool. 10 more people in your team is better. And I think it's a misconception. I think more is not better. Better is better. And you have to find ways to do better. Perhaps you need a specific tool to solve that problem. And there are different approaches around that. And perhaps it makes sense to create more of this content. But I think particularly in this age where AI can help us speed up so many things, it, I think, encourages us to bring back focus and perhaps slow down a little bit and say, what is it we do as an organization? How can we do this better? And I think we will find we probably don't necessarily need more quantity, but we need more quality.
So just to paraphrase that, because it's one of the questions we had, right? How can companies stand out in a day and age where there is an abundance of generated material, which is basically what you started to ask, right? It's, I think it's very interesting because, you know, we see all the time people are, you know, I just did it like 15 minutes ago or so, asking people to post things on LinkedIn, right? It's all about pushing things out there. And I think we will see that also going forward, that there's an expectation that things will always be out there. But how can you make sure that you focus on the quality aspects of things and not just on the quantity? And I think that's interesting.
So, well, first of all, I would like to just comment on the jobs part, that I think this comes back to the question of the triple bottom line once again, and the ESG and the, you know, the sustainability goals, that we don't have to create jobs for people, but we have to create opportunities for people. So there is a social responsibility amongst boards, in my opinion, to be very conscious of the fact that all organizations at a board level have to be thinking about the impact that they have on the human factor of their employees, because the employees are stakeholders too. So we are, as board members and board directors, responsible for all our stakeholders. So there's that. The question of the speed, well, you know, I said it earlier, faster, better, quicker till the wheels come off the bus. Yeah, there's classic examples of that all around. I mean, companies just falling over themselves with features and nobody buying. So I'm definitely in the top right-hand quadrant, and I will take a quote from one of the favorites, which is Karl Lagerfeld, which is that in the quality business, we're not in the business of managing supply, we're in the business of managing scarcity. And if you look at Abramovich, you know, the artist, she sat in silence, and that was her art piece. So it's not always that we have to fill everything with sound and space and content.
Interesting. Anyone wants to weigh in?
I mean, the thing that's so great about that is it really is the case that, I mean, differentiation, I would argue, has always been the hallmark of great marketing. You stand out, you're differentiated. And so if you've got a whole bunch of other people that are moving in this direction of just piling quantity, yeah, finding ways to be like, no, actually we do very few things. We do one thing a year, and everyone is waiting for that and paying attention for it, because like, if we miss that, man, I think it's a really interesting strategy.
It's a bit like going shopping in Century 21 when you've got 20 minutes to spend and you need an evening dress. You know.
I don't know that situation.
But you know, I mean, this is a customer insight for you. You know.
On weekends.
On weekends, yeah.
True.
So going back to, you know, the generated media, I have 2 kids. They're growing up, 8 and 12-year-old. And, you know, one of the first questions that came up when I was doing this was, how can we prepare new generations for critical thinking? I know it's, you know, a bit on the side, but at the same time, I think it's extremely important to reflect around it. You know, we're doing a lot when it comes to the content side of things, meaning the stuff that's going to be out there also needs to be something that can be consumed and be evaluated. And I'm, you know, wondering, can we imagine seeing AI here, doing something that helps us as well? Not just, you know, generating things, but being able to, yeah, do some kind of a Turing test type of approach at it.
Well, you see, large language models are giving you more and more the source for their answer. Without asking for it, they are giving you the source. But, of course, it's almost impossible to know why did I get exactly this answer. And if I ask the same question the next day, I will get something else. So they are just, they have all the training data, and I look at it as an assistive tool, using it to actually improve my work, but it should be my work. I was a journalist, I was an editor. I could never ask any AI to write a blog post for me, because the language and the text, that's me. But I do understand that people who is not a writer or an artist or whatever who like to use the tool, but I think rule number 1 is never publish a code that you don't understand, and never publish a text which you don't understand, really don't understand, because that's the biggest failure you can do by using AI as a tool. So it should always be a close companionship between machine and humans, but we should always be in charge of what we are using AI for in content creation or in more like the business that we are discussing here these days.
Janus?
So I love the topic of critical thinking. I do think it's key, and I think there's so much we can do there. The school system, I think, in the Nordic countries are a little bit different than in the rest of the world. I think, unfortunately, we've looked quite a lot to America and have introduced much more testing, teach to the test and things like that. But now that you made it personal, also talking about kids, I think I have learned a little bit the hard way that my kids rarely do what I say, but they do as I do. You know, they mimic me and they find out how do I act, and then they do that way. And I think similarly in your workplaces, I think there's this concept of psychological safety. Like, do you encourage critical thinking in your workplace? If you can go home and talk about stories of how that actually happened, how the boss said something and then somebody else had an element or a moment of critical thinking and that was good. If you can go home and tell those stories, perhaps also put some trust in the teachers that they would do well, and the parallel to teachers in our workplaces, because I do think critical thinking is the key that will set us apart, perhaps, to be honest, both in terms of the East and the West, because I think that's one thing that we as Europeans have been good at, and it's something that if we don't watch out for it, we'll lose it. But I think this age of AI really calls for more critical thinking, and I think we have an opportunity to lead as role models.
I'm quite happy to see no one totally disagree here, because it would have been a bit an interesting one. So the last question I have is, and we kind of started to discuss it, right? But what is the best way for humans and AI to work together to create something real and personal? And I know you may be, reacting to the whole personal thing, but the real and personal, I think it is kind of what you said as well. It's not just generated, and you need to have a human in it, but any thoughts on how we can make sure that's still kept as gold in our everyday?
I think that the possibilities out there for shared ideation are amazing. I think my presentation earlier was a classic example of that. But it is a synthesis of multiple points of view. And to speak to the question of critical thinking, you need the tone from the top, but you need many people in the room. So you need multiple voices and human voices on the subject, not just one. So that would be my answer to that. Tone from the top, multiple voices, and a synthesis.
All right.
Janus?
I think everybody here has tried working with a chatbot, perhaps a couple of years ago, and perhaps we're a little bit disappointed. But I do think that was a sign of things to come. And I think with the advent of AI, we're seeing conversational interfaces taken to the next level. And I do think that's going to happen not just on websites with agents, where you may be able to also type, pass me to a human, but there's a lot of things that meaningfully an agent could do for you, a digital agent. But similarly, I think the DXP interface, the CDP interface, the interface you're working with in the B2B context is also going to be quite likely more conversational than those form-based interface we've seen so far. And I think that's going to have a huge impact, and we'll see whole new AI-assisted workflows where the human then has a certain role, but AI enables us to take that to the next level.
Any last comments? We're basically a minute and a half away from reaching the end. So I think this is the time to add your thoughts. It's quite open if you guys want to add anything now.
I'll just real quickly build on what Janus was saying there is, so looking at MarTech all these years, one of the things I suspect many of you have felt this, seen this, is as the technology has gotten more and more advanced and it's gotten more complex, utilization rates overall have gone down. It's just the technology is too hard for too many people to learn all the things it can do. And I think you're absolutely right. This is a really exciting place for these conversational interfaces that, frankly, is a pretty massive, this is like the sort of leap that, GUI, was, 30, 40, 50 years ago. This sort of new UI paradigm that will actually make software a lot more usable to a lot more people.
Bente?
I would say to everyone I'm talking to, start learning, start exploring, and start being curious about all these different tools, because it's a low entrance. Everyone can learn how to use most of those tools. And instead of, we want to decrease inequality. But I'm aware that if you don't learn the new AI tools, and if you don't get the personal competence, the inequality will just increase. And that's what we need to avoid. So everyone should be encouraged to explore and learn what this is all about.
I think, I mean, we're basically at the end now, and I think that was a very interesting way of rounding it off. I'd like to say thanks a lot to the panelists, and thanks a lot for everyone to attend, and hope we'll have a great evening.